Thank you for joining Pioneer. I'm Chris with Norman Public Library Central, and this is the 23rd video in our series on the Swift computer programming language. In our last lesson, we looked at subclasses. We created a lendable base class, and then two subclasses, book and DVD. Book and DVD both derived from the lendable class. Your challenge was to add a way for each one of these classes to tell us how many days you could check the item out for. Here's my solution. In my lendable base class, I've added a public member variable, lending period, and I've defaulted to 7. In my book class, I added an initializer, and in that initializer, I set the lending period to 21. I don't need to do that for my DVD class because my DVD does check out for 7 days. Now, to access my lending period, it's just a member variable of my class. Today, we'll learn about a new kind of data object called an enumeration. Let's have a look. You can download this starter code at lesson23-enumerations.swift on the Pioneer Library System webpage at the URL on your screen. I've created a generic class called media that I intend to hold all kinds of different items, DVDs, books, magazines, Blu-rays, and what I'd like to do is store what type of item media is. Of course, I could use a string for this, but remember that the downside of strings are first that Xcode can't provide me with autocomplete function, so I have to do a little more typing, and the compiler can't check to see whether I've spelled it correctly, for example. I'd have to do all of that myself. But with an enumeration data type, we can make the compiler do a lot of that work for us. Here's how those work. I'll begin with the keyword enum, E-N-U-M, which is short for enumeration or enumerated. And then we'll give it a type. I'll call mine media type. So far, it looks just like a class, but this is where things get different. Instead of declaring things like variables or functions, most enums simply list out all of their possible cases. I'll begin with the keyword case. And the first item in my cases is book. On the next line, I'll simply add the next item. So I've listed out a few different media types here. Now, in my media class, I can create a member variable. I'm going to default it to book. To do that, I'm going to type the dot operator. And as soon as I type the dot operator, autocomplete will offer me a list of all the available media types. This can save me a lot of typing down the road. So I'll select book. You'll notice that I've used a naming convention here where I capitalized the M in media for my enum and I lowercased the M in media for my variable. That's a pretty common convention in computer programming. You don't have to do it, but a lot of Swift programmers do. Let's look at what happens if I print out my media type. When I run my code, Swift prints out the word book. The basic enumerated data type provides some really nice functionality for you. But what if, for example, you'd like each one of these types to be numbered? Maybe you need to store them in a database or something like that. You can tell Swift what the underlying data type of your enumeration is. The most typical, dating back to the C programming days, is an integer. So I'll tell Swift that my enumeration is backed by an integer. And I can actually tell Swift which item is which. So I'll tell Swift to start the numbering at 0 for book, and then everything after that will increment. If I print out my enumeration now, it still prints book, but now that I've added an explicit backing type, I can also print out my enumeration's raw value. And when I print out raw value, I get the number 0. So there are many circumstances when you're using an enumeration where it's nice to be able to number these. You can back your enumeration by things other than integers. For example, I can tell Swift to back my enumeration with a string. And then for each one of these, I could make a nicer string that represents my data type. Maybe I'll capitalize them. And I'll leave off magazine so we can see what happens. Now, if I print out new media.mediatype.raw value for my book, I get book with a capital B, so it's a nicer way of printing it out. Now let's say that it's a magazine. There's that dot operator again, giving me a shortcut. If you back your enum with a string and don't provide an explicit value for it, it will use the case. In this case, magazine with a lowercase m. Your challenge is to create a new enumeration that lets you indicate whether the person in this item is an author or a director or a star or any other person type that you might want to affiliate with a media object. Good luck.